is a specific kind of madness that only exists on the interstate after 3 a.m. It's a quiet, rhythmic insanity that starts in the base of your skull and slowly works its way down your spine until your hands on the steering wheel don't feel like your hands anymore. They feel like tools, mechanical appendages attached to a machine that is hurtling through a dark, indifferent void. I had been in that state for 6 hours. The road was no longer a path. It was a loop, a glitching animation of black asphalt, white lines, and the occasional green reflective sign that blurred past like a ghost. I was somewhere in the middle of the country, in that vast empty space where the map becomes a suggestion and the cell service dies, a slow, agonizing death. My world had shrunk to the size of my cabin. The dashboard lights, a dim, sickly amber, were the only sun I knew. They cast a pale glow over the empty passenger seat, where a layer of dust had settled over a crumpled map I no longer knew how to read. I was driving away from the fire. That was the only thing I knew for certain. Every mile I put between myself and that scorched plot of land in Ohio felt like a victory, but it was a hollow one. You can outrun a person, and you can outrun a law, but you can't outrun a smell. The scent of charred pine and melted plastic was baked into the fabric of my seats. It was in my hair. It was in the back of my throat, a metallic tang that tasted like failure. I had the windows down, letting the freezing plains air whip through the cabin, hoping the wind would scour the memory out of me. But the wind just roared, a mindless, hungry sound that seemed to mock the tiny engine of my sedan. I was reaching the limit. My eyes were playing tricks on me. The white lines weren't just lines anymore. They were teeth, snapping at the tires. The shadows of the overpasses looked like giant, thin-limbed creatures crouching over the road, waiting for me to pass beneath them so they could drop onto the roof. The exhaustion was a physical weight, a leaden blanket draped over my shoulders. I needed to sleep, but the thought of closing my eyes felt like a death sentence. In the dark, behind my eyelids, the fire was always waiting. I'd see the orange glow. I'd hear the crackle of the beams. I'd see the silhouette in the upstairs window, the one that didn't move. So I kept driving. I drove until the road began to feel like it was vibrating at a frequency I shouldn't be able to hear. A low, pulsing hum that matched the beat of my heart. Thump thrum, thump thrum. I started to wonder if I was still on the interstate at all. The cornfields had disappeared, replaced by a wall of absolute blackness. No trees. No fences, no distant farmhouse lights, just the road and the void. Then the glow appeared. It wasn't the warm, welcoming yellow of a rest stop or the harsh, flickering neon of a franchise gas station. It was a cold, surgical white. It started as a pinprick on the horizon, a tiny hole poked in the fabric of the night, and as I drew closer, it expanded with a terrifying speed. It didn't cast light like a lamp. It seemed to consume the darkness around it. The fog that had been clinging to the road evaporated as I hit the off-ramp. My car didn't just slow down. The very physics of motion seemed to change. The vibration of the engine, the rattle of the loose change in the cup holder, the whistle of the wind, it all stopped. It was as if I had driven into a vacuum. I looked at the speedometer. It said I was doing 60, but I felt like I was standing perfectly still. The off-ramp wasn't made of asphalt. It was a matte black composite, smooth as silk and cold as ice. I pulled into the lot, and the sheer scale of the place hit me. It was a cathedral of light. The canopy over the pumps was a vast, white plane of seamless steel, glowing from within. There were no lights hanging from it. The metal itself was the light. Beneath it sat the pumps, silver monoliths that looked like they had been carved from a single block of mercury. There were no hoses, no screens, no credit card slots, just pillars of perfection standing in a row like silent sentinels. I brought the car to a halt at pump 4. When I turned the key, the engine didn't sputter or cough. It simply ceased to exist. The silence that followed was heavy. It was a pressurized silence that made my ears pop and my head swim. I sat there for a long minute, my hands still gripping the wheel, staring at the store. The building was a box of glass and white light. It was so clean, it looked like a 3D model that hadn't been finished yet. No dirt, no scuffs, no signs of the world's friction. There was no brand name on the sign, no Shell, no Exxon, no Circle K. Just a single word, written in a font that felt too modern, too sharp, too deliberate. Station. I opened the door, and the air that rushed in didn't smell like the Nebraska plains. It didn't smell like the cold or the earth. It smelled like nothing. It was the scent of a clean room, of a laboratory, of a place where life was not allowed to leave a mark. I stepped out onto the matte black pavement. My boots made no sound. I looked down, expecting to see my shadow stretched out behind me by the glare of the canopy, but there was nothing. The light was coming from the ground. It was coming from the air. It was coming from the very molecules of the station. I was standing in a world without shadows, and for the first time in 6 years, I felt the fire in my chest start to go cold. The glass doors didn't slide open with the mechanical groan of a sensor-driven motor. They didn't swing on hinges. As I approached, the very substance of the glass seemed to vibrate, becoming a shimmering veil before simply parting. It was like stepping through a wall of cold water that didn't leave me wet. I crossed the threshold, and the transition was total. The air inside the station was pressurized, a heavy, sterile weight that pressed against my eardrums until they popped with a sharp, crystalline click. The temperature was a constant, indifferent 68 degrees. It wasn't cool. It was a total absence of thermal character. The interior was a cathedral of consumerism, stripped of its soul. The aisles were long, impossibly long. From the outside, the building looked like a standard convenience store, maybe 3,000 square feet. But inside, the rows of white shelving stretched back into a perspective that felt fraudulent. The floor was a grid of white tiles, so polished I could see my own terrified face looking back at me from beneath my boots. And the light, God, the light. It was everywhere. It didn't come from fixtures. The very air seemed to be phosphorescent, casting no shadows, leaving no corner for a secret to hide. It was a place where everything was visible, yet nothing felt real. I walked down aisle 1. The sign above it was a simple white board with a single word in black. Essentials. I expected bread, milk, maybe some motor oil. What I found was a nightmare of branding. Row after row of matte gray bags sat on the shelves, each one aligned to the millimeter. The labels were a flat, clinical font, crunch. I reached out, my hand trembling, and picked one up. It had no weight. It felt like I was holding a vacuum wrapped in plastic. There was no rustle of chips, no shifting of contents. When I squeezed it, the material didn't crinkle. It felt like soft, warm skin. I turned it over. There were no ingredients, no nutritional facts, just a single sentence on the back. For the hunger that remains when the body is forgotten. I put it back, my heart hammering against my ribs. My touch had left a faint smudge on the pristine gray bag, and as I watched, the material seemed to heal itself, the smudge fading away until the bag was perfect once again. I moved to the next section, stillness. This aisle was lined with glass bottles filled with a clear liquid. The labels didn't say water. They said still. I took a bottle from the shelf, and the coldness of the glass was so intense it felt like a burn. I looked at the liquid inside. It didn't move. I shook the bottle harder and harder, but the fluid remained a solid, unmoving block of clarity. It wasn't frozen. It was just still. I looked at my reflection in the glass of the refrigerator door behind the bottles. I froze. The man looking back at me wasn't the haggard, broken traveler who had been driving for 6 hours. He didn't have the gray in his beard or the deep, hollow lines of grief around his eyes. He was 24. He was wearing the flannel shirt I had lost in the fire. He looked happy. He looked like he still believed the world was a safe place. I reached out to touch the glass, to touch him. But my fingers met only the cold, unyielding surface of the display. The reflection is always the hardest part to stalk, a voice said. I spun around so fast I nearly knocked over a display of silver cans labeled fuel. Behind the counter stood a man who didn't belong in any world I knew. He was tall, impossibly, terrifyingly tall. His head was less than an inch from the ceiling, and his limbs were long and tapering, ending in fingers that looked like they had too many knuckles. He was wearing a suit of charcoal gray that seemed to absorb the ambient light of the store, making him look like a silhouette cut out of a photograph. His face was a masterpiece of the uncanny valley. His skin was too smooth, his eyes too symmetrical, his smile a fraction of a second too slow. He didn't look at me. He was using a pair of silver tweezers to adjust a single pack of gum on a tray. I just needed coffee, I stammered. My voice sounded small and ragged in that vast, silent hall. The man finally looked up. His eyes weren't eyes. They were two polished mirrors reflecting the endless aisles behind me. Coffee is for those who wish to wake up, Marcus, he said. His voice was a smooth, melodic drone that seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my brain. But no one comes to the station to wake up. They come here because they are finally ready to sleep. He knew my name. The realization hit me like a physical blow. How do you know who I am? The clerk leaned forward, his long torso folding like a carpenter's roll. I am the inventory manager, Marcus, and you have been part of the incoming ledger for a very long time. 6 years, 3 months, and 12 days to be precise. Ever since the night the orange light turned your world to ash. He reached under the counter and pulled out a small crystal vial. It was empty, yet it seemed to have a gravitational pull, a weight that made the air around it warp. You've been driving across the country trying to find a road that doesn't lead back to the fire, but the road is a circle, Marcus, and every circle leads back here to the symmetry, to the stillness. I backed away, hitting the shelf of still bottles. They didn't rattle. They didn't fall. They remained perfectly, terrifyingly aligned. I want to leave, I whispered. The The clerk's smile grew, revealing teeth that were far too numerous and far too white. Of course you do, but where would you go? Back to the interstate, back to the smell of the smoke and the sound of your brother's voice calling from the second floor? You can't leave the station, Marcus, because you brought the station with you. I'm just the one who helps you unpack. The crystal vial sat on the white marble counter like a trap. It was small, no larger than a finger, but it seemed to hold the density of a collapsed star. I stared into it, and for a moment, the sterile white light of the station vanished. I wasn't standing in a convenience store anymore. I was back on the sidewalk in Ohio. I could feel the heat on my face, a blistering, angry roar that made the skin of my forehead tighten. I could smell the melting shingles. I could hear the windows shattering, a sound like diamonds hitting concrete. And there, in the center of the vial's glass, was the window, the second-floor bedroom. I saw the curtain catch fire, a sudden bloom of orange, and for a split second, I saw a hand press against the glass. A small hand, my brother. "It's so heavy, isn't it?" The clerk's voice was a cold needle in my ear. He hadn't moved, yet he seemed to be looming over me from every direction at once. The weight of a single moment. It's been 6 years, and yet you carry that heat every second of every day. You drive to cool it down, but the air of the interstate only fans the flames. You are a furnace, Marcus, and you are burning yourself to ash. I looked up at him, my eyes stinging. "You can take it away, truly." "I don't just take it," the clerk whispered, his mirror eyes shimmering with a dull, silver hunger. "I refine it, I align it, I give it a place on a shelf where it can be beautiful, where it can be still, where it can never hurt you again. In the world outside, memories are jagged things. They cut. But here, they are geometry, they are inventory, they are perfect." He pushed the vial toward me. It slid across the marble without a sound. "Just uncork the glass, Marcus. Think of the fire. Think of the heat. Think of the hand on the window. And let it go. Give it to the station." My fingers touched the glass. It was cold, so cold it felt like it was drinking the warmth from my blood. I looked back at the doors, at the white void where the road used to be. I realized then that there was no back. There was no car waiting for me. There was no highway. There was only the choice between the fire and the stillness. And I was so tired of the fire. I pulled the cork. There was no sound, no dramatic rush of wind, just a sudden sharp scent of wood smoke that filled the room, followed by a terrifying, absolute silence. I felt a tugging behind my eyes, a sensation like a thread being pulled from a piece of silk. I saw it leave me, a thin, coiling mist of deep, bruised orange. It poured out of my mouth, out of my tear ducts, out of the pores of my skin. It was the color of the sunset through a house fire. It was the sound of the sirens I had tried to ignore. It was the what if that had been my only companion for 1,000 nights. I watched it spiral into the vial. The glass began to glow, a pulsing, rhythmic orange that illuminated the clerk's pale, poreless face. He watched the mist with an expression of pure, religious ecstasy. As the last of the smoke left my body, I felt a sensation I hadn't known in years. I felt light, but it wasn't the lightness of relief. It was the lightness of an empty box. I looked down at my hands. They were pale. The scars I'd gotten from the heat of that night were fading, smoothing over into the same perfect, vellum-like skin as the clerk. I tried to remember my brother's name. I knew I had one. I knew there was a boy in a window, but the image was gone. I could remember the fact of the fire, but I couldn't feel the heat. It was like reading a sentence in a book I didn't care about. The boy was just a shape. The fire was just a color. Transaction complete, the clerk said. He picked up the vial, which was now a solid, glowing amber. He turned it over, checking the alignment, and then walked to aisle 9. I followed him, my movements becoming fluid, mechanical. I didn't feel the floor beneath my feet. I didn't feel the air in my lungs. I watched as he placed the vial on a shelf between a silver tin labeled Neglect and a matte black box labeled Cowardice. He moved it a fraction of an inch to the left, then a hair to the right, until it was perfectly centered. Where do I go now? I asked. My voice didn't sound like mine anymore. It sounded like the hum of the neon lights. It sounded like the pressurized air. The clerk turned to me. He wasn't a predator anymore. He was a supervisor. You are home, Marcus. You are the newest addition to the collection. Aisle 9, Section B. Your label is the unanswered cry. It's a premium grade. Very high energy. I looked at the shelf. There was an empty space, exactly my width, exactly my height. I walked toward it. It felt right. It felt inevitable. I stepped onto the ledge, turning my back to the wall, facing the endless, symmetrical aisles of the station. My body began to stiffen. I felt the matte black pavement's texture spreading up my legs, turning my skin into the same weightless, silent material as the crunch bags. My eyes fixed on a point on the opposite wall. A single, glowing tile. I felt my thoughts begin to align. My memories, my fears, my very name. They were all being processed, categorized, and filed away into the white light. I wasn't a man anymore. I was a product. I was a proof of concept. I was part of the perfection. The clerk walked back to the counter and began to polish the marble with a white silk cloth. He didn't look back at me. He didn't need to. I was where I belonged. Suddenly, the silence was broken. Cling. The silver chime of the front door. I couldn't move my head, but I could see the reflection in the glass of the refrigerator across from me. A pair of headlights cut through the white void outside. A car, exhausted, dirty, and smelling of the real world, pulled up to pump 4. A woman stepped out. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. She looked like she was carrying a mountain on her back. She looked at the sign that said, Station, her eyes wide with a desperate, pathetic hope. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell her to run, to get back in the car, to embrace the noise and the fire and the messy, beautiful pain of being alive, but I couldn't. My mouth was a perfect, silent line. My chin was aligned to the horizon. My label was facing forward. The clerk looked up from his counter, his mirror eyes reflecting the new arrival. Welcome, he whispered, his voice carrying through the store like a cool breeze. Can I help you find what you're looking for? The woman stepped into the light, and I watched her shadow disappear. I felt a thrill of cold, mechanical satisfaction. The station was almost full, and a full station is a perfect one.
The interstate is a messy, inefficient thing. To the humans crawling across it, it's a vein of asphalt and hope. To me, it is a sieve. It is a massive, continent-spanning trap designed to catch the ones who have become too heavy to keep moving. Most travelers are light. They are full of trivialities, small joys, and shallow anxieties that evaporate in the sun. They pass through the sieve without a trace, but every so often, the sensors twitch. A frequency appears on the horizon, a low, oscillating hum of high-grade agony. It is the sound of a soul that has stopped looking forward and has begun to turn inward, collapsing under the weight of a single, unchangeable moment. Tonight, the hum was exquisite. I felt him 50 miles away. Marcus, a name that will soon be a serial number. His vibration was a deep, resonant orange, the color of oxidized iron and wood smoke. It was a fire frequency, one of the most stable and energy-rich traumas we can harvest. I watched his progress on the primary monitors, his tiny sedan a flickering spark against the velvet black of the Nebraska void. He was driving at 80 miles per hour, but in the geography that matters, he was standing perfectly still. He was trapped in the loop of 6 years ago, and the harder he pressed the accelerator, the deeper he sank into our territory. People think the station is a building. It isn't. It is a localized rupture in the fabric of their real. We don't build it. We manifest it where the noise of a traveler reaches its peak. When Marcus hit the psychological breaking point, when his exhaustion finally stripped away his defenses, I reached out and pulled the exit ramp toward him. The transition is my favorite part. I watched as his reality began to fray. I tuned the atmosphere to total zero, stripping the sound of the wind and the smell of the earth from his senses. To Marcus, it felt like a malfunction of physics. To me, it was simply clearing the workspace. You cannot perform a clean harvest in a room full of static. I replaced the asphalt with our matte black composite, a non-reflective sound-dampening substrate that prepares the subject for the stillness. When he pulled up to pump 4, I began the initialization. I don't need to charge him for gas. His presence alone was refueling the canopy's light. The mere proximity of his guilt was enough to power the station for 3 cycles. I stood behind the counter and adjusted my cuffs. My skin, a synthetic poreless vellum, shimmered under the phosphorescence. I checked the ledger. Everything was in order. Aisle 9 was empty, the shelf was dusted, the vacuum was primed. I heard his car door close, a muffled, pathetic sound in the pressurized silence I had created. He was stepping out of his life and into my inventory. He didn't know it yet, but he had already stopped being a person. He was now a prospect, and by the time the sun didn't rise, he would be a product. I picked up my tweezers and adjusted a pack of gum. 1 millimeter. Symmetry is the only law here, and Marcus was about to become very, very symmetrical. The doors parted, and the noise entered. Humans are incredibly loud even when they are silent. They are walking, breathing storms of biological failure. As Marcus crossed the threshold, he brought a cacophony with him. The frantic, uneven thumping of a heart pushed to its limit. The wet, ragged sound of lungs struggling against the pressurized purity of my air, and that persistent, rotting scent of charred pine that clung to his psyche, like a parasite. To him, the station was a sanctuary of light. To me, he was a smudge on a clean lens. He was a disorganized pile of data that needed to be pruned, polished, and filed. I watched him from the periphery, my movements so precise, they appeared motionless. I let him wander. A cornered animal needs to feel like it's found a burrow before you can truly study it. I watched him drift down aisle 1. It is always a fascinating study in primitive psychology to see them interact with the inventory. They look for brands, familiar, colorful anchors to ground them in a reality that has already abandoned them. They crave the familiar lie of corporate comfort. He stopped at a shelf of crunch. I watched his thumb press into the synthetic matte gray membrane of the bag. He expected the resistance of trapped air and fried starch. Instead, he felt the pliancy of the void. He didn't realize that the bag wasn't holding food. It was holding the hunger of a woman from 1994, a soul who had starved herself in a cold apartment waiting for a phone call that never came. We've refined her desperation into a stable, shelf-ready form. It's one of our best sellers in the long-term regret category. It has a specific vibration, a low, hollow thrumming that satisfies a hunger Marcus hasn't even realized he has yet. He put it back, and I watched the shelf heal. My inventory does not tolerate fingerprints. Then he moved to aisle 4. Stillness. I saw the exact moment the softening phase took hold. He froze at the sight of his own reflection in the glass of the refrigerator. This is the part of the harvest I take a particular professional pride in. By projecting a version of him from 6 years ago, the man he was before the fire, before the guilt, before the gray, I wasn't being kind. Kindness is a human concept, as messy and inefficient as a leaking faucet. I was highlighting the contrast. I was sharpening the jagged edge of his current life so that the pain would feel unbearable. I wanted him to see the smooth skin of his past self and feel the phantom heat of the fire on his current cheeks. I wanted him to realize that the man in the glass was a ghost, and the man standing in my aisle was a corpse that had forgotten to stop walking. The reflection is always the hardest part to stalk, I told him. I enjoyed the way he jumped. A 4 hertz spike in cortisol, exquisite quality. I looked at him with my mirror eyes, letting him see his own small, broken face reflected back at him in duplicate. To him, I was a monster, a tall shadow in a charcoal suit. To me, he was a specimen of direct negligence that was finally ripening. I just needed coffee, he stammered. Coffee. They always want stimulants. They want to whip their failing nervous systems into a frenzy, hoping that if they move fast enough, the shadows won't be able to catch them. They don't realize that the nightmare is the only thing keeping them awake. I leaned over the counter, my long torso folding with the silent, oily grace of a predator. I explained to him that we don't deal in such crude chemicals. We offer a much more permanent solution to exhaustion. We offer the end of the road. I watched him look at the silver cans of fuel. He thought of gasoline. He thought of internal combustion. He didn't understand that the fuel in this station is the energy of the unresolved. Every mile he had driven in the dark, every hour he spent staring at the road, he was generating a charge. He was a battery of grief, and the station was finally plugging him in. I led him toward the center of the store, toward the counter where the crystal vial sat waiting. I could feel the heat radiating off him. The fire frequency was peaking. It was a deep, pulsing orange that made the marble under my fingers vibrate. Most humans dilute their tragedies with time or healing. They smudge the lines of their trauma until it's a gray, unrecognizable blur of moving on. But Marcus was a purist. He had nurtured his cowardice for 6 long years, feeding it every mile of the interstate. He was a master of his own misery, and it was time for that mastery to serve a higher purpose. "Where is my car?" he asked. His voice was cracking, a thin, brittle sound. "The vehicle was a vessel for the journey," I said, my voice a melodic drone that bypassed his ears and resonated in his very bones. "But journeys must conclude, Marcus. You didn't come here for gas. You came here because you're tired of the noise. You came here because you want the symmetry to take you." I reached for the vial. This is the delicate part of the logistics, the consent protocol. I cannot simply reach into his chest and pull the fire out. It must be offered. It must be a trade. I had to wait for the moment when the noise of his memories became louder than his instinct to survive. I had to wait for him to realize that the white horizon outside the glass was the only home he had left. I watched his hands. They were shaking, a rhythmic, beautiful tremor that signaled the imminent collapse of his resolve. He was almost ready. He was almost perfect. The crystal vial sat on the white marble counter, a tiny, transparent vacuum waiting for its purpose. To Marcus, it was a terrifying choice. To me, it was simply an open ledger. I watched his eyes track the light as it caught the rim of the glass. I could see the reflection of his own indecision flickering in his pupils, a frantic, high-frequency oscillation that sent ripples through the station's atmosphere. He was vibrating with the energy of 6 years of repressed agony. It was a beautiful, unstable charge. If a memory is a jagged piece of glass, then Marcus was a man who had been swallowing shards for half a decade. I could hear them rattling inside him. I could smell the metallic tang of his internal bleeding. "Transaction almost complete," I whispered, though I kept my lips perfectly still. I didn't need to speak to him with sound. I was speaking to the friction in his soul. He reached out. His fingers were trembling, a rhythmic 4 hertz tremor that signaled the imminent collapse of his nervous system's defenses. When his skin finally made contact with the crystal, the station's floorboards groaned in anticipation. The entity beneath the pumps, the deep, lightless hunger that anchors this facility to the interstate, began to stir. It felt the fire frequency. It wanted the heat. I felt the low frequency thrumming in the soles of my boots, a heartbeat that Marcus was too distracted to notice. "Just uncork the glass, Marcus," I said, my voice a soothing, clinical drone. "Release the entropy. Let the station absorb the jagged edges." I watched him pull the cork. The sound wasn't a pop. It was a sigh. The sound of a lung collapsing, the sound of a fire being deprived of oxygen. For a second, the absolute white of the store was stained. A thick, coiling mist of deep, bruised orange began to rise from Marcus's skin. It didn't drift like smoke. It moved with a heavy, liquid intent, drawn into the vial by the station's gravitational pull. It was the fire. I saw the memories passing through the air as shimmering, distorted frames, the orange glow against the midnight siding, the sound of the roof timber snapping like a bone, the silhouette of a small hand against a second-floor window. It was a magnificent harvest. The energy was so concentrated, it made the air taste like copper and ozone. I watched Marcus as he was hollowed out. It is a process I never tire of witnessing. First, the color drains from the iris, the personality's signature being deleted in real time. Then, the micro-tremors in the hands cease. The noise of his identity, the quirks, the specific way he held his shoulders, the cadence of his breath, was being liquefied and bottled. He was becoming lighter, not with relief, but with the terrifying buoyancy of an empty vessel. To Marcus, this felt like peace. He thought he was being saved. He didn't understand that peace in the station is just the word we use for deletion. I picked up the vial. It was now a solid, glowing amber, pulsing with a rhythmic heat that warmed even my cold synthetic palms. It was a direct negligence sample of the highest grade. It would power the primary cooling systems of the station for 300 cycles. I walked toward aisle 9, my movements fluid and silent. I could feel Marcus following me. He wasn't walking so much as he was being pulled, his feet dragging across the tiles like a puppet on a string. He was no longer a person. He was a prospect whose status had just shifted to product. Section B, I murmured, more to the inventory logs than to him. Between neglect and cowardice. I found the gap. It was a perfect, human-sized incision in the symmetry of the shelving. I turned and watched Marcus approach. He looked at the shelf with a blank, beautiful compliance. The fire was gone. The noise was gone. He was finally as still as the water in our bottles. I reached out and adjusted his chin, tilting it upward so his gaze was fixed on the infinite convergence point of the opposite wall. I straightened his arms, aligning his fingers with the seams of his flannel shirt. As I touched him, I felt his texture change. His skin was no longer porous or warm. It was taking on the matte, plasticized finish of the crunch bags. His eyes were becoming glossy, fixed, and unblinking. 2 more mirrors to add to my collection. I stepped back, checking the alignment. 1 millimeter to the left. Perfect. "You are home, Marcus," I said, though he no longer had the ears to hear me. "You are the newest addition to the collection. Label, The Unanswered Cry. Premium grade. Aisle 9, Section B." I walked back to the counter. There was a smudge on the marble, a tiny, pathetic drop of sweat Marcus had left behind during the transaction. I pulled a white silk cloth from my pocket and polished the stone until it was a perfect, unblemished void. I checked the clock. 4:44 a.m. The cycle was complete. The station was balanced. But the road never sleeps. The silver chime of the front door rang, a thin, crystalline sound that tasted like copper. I didn't need to look at the monitors to know the frequency. A woman. A 1999 sedan with a failing alternator. She was vibrating with an indigo blue betrayal frequency, sharp, jagged, and full of high-grade kinetic energy. She had been driving since the coast, trying to find a place where the memory of her husband's face wouldn't follow her. I watched her through the glass. She looked at the sign that said station, her face a mask of desperate, exhausted hope. She thought she had found an oasis in the dark. She thought the light was a promise of safety. I straightened my charcoal tie. I checked my reflection in the polished marble, ensuring my smile was exactly 15% too wide, the perfect bait for the broken. "Welcome," I whispered as the doors dissolved before her, inviting her into the vacuum. "Can I help you find what you're looking for?" The station was almost full, and a full station is a perfect one.